Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch. This is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy, and today I'm here with Lori Gruen. Thank you, Lori, for joining me for this dialogue about empathy.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Ed.
So I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction that I have from your website. It says you're a professor of philosophy, feminist, gender, and sexuality studies and environmental studies at Wesleyan University, and you coordinate the Wesleyan Animal Studies, and that your work lies at the intersection of ethical theory and practice. Is that kind of it?
That's it. I wear a lot of hats, yes.
Great. And you also just came out with this new book, which is why I contacted you, called Entangled Empathy, an Alternative Ethic for Our Relationship with Animals. And I have a picture of it here I can put up on the screen.
Thanks.
And this is also a copy here. It's about 120 or so pages. Very readable as well. I've really enjoyed it and really got a lot. It was a very meaningful book for me. So really looking forward to having this dialogue with you about it.
I'm so glad. I wrote the book. I'm a philosopher by training, and I work in ethics and practical ethics in particular, as you had suggested. And one of the things I was really concerned to do in this book is to make it accessible to people who weren't just studying philosophy or thinking philosophically in an academic way. So I'm really delighted to hear that it was something of interest to you, especially since you're also deeply interested and involved in thinking about a culture of empathy. So that makes me really happy.
Yeah, it was definitely meaningful, so I'm really glad to talk to you about it because of these. But before we get into that, I'll just mention if anyone wants to contact you, they can go to your website at lorigruen.com.
Right.
Is that right? And I have a picture of the website here. We can just put it up on the screen just to give people a view of it. So it just shows all the books that you've written or edited, or do you want to go over just quickly, kind of all these different books?
Right. So this year, the top 3 books came out within the past year. As you mentioned, Entangled Empathy is the book that we're discussing. It just came out last month. The Ecofeminism book is a book that Carol Adams and I edited together and wrote pieces in, and it was a book that we put together actually as a result of a conference that I held after the death of our good friend ecofeminist Marty Keel. And it's Marty Keel's work, even though she didn't often use the term empathy, Marty Keel's work was really, really inspirational for me in thinking about sort of different ways of talking about ethics, and so that's the book, Ecofeminism.
Well, it's really great to hear about that because Marty lived near me here, and I knew her, so that was really interesting that you knew her. And so inspired.
Long time old friend. Yeah.
Great. So, were there any of the other books that you wanted to talk about?
And so the other book that I have, the other book that's up there is The Ethics of Captivity, which also came out last year, which is a collection of essays that's trying to really carve new ground in thinking about captivity, both for humans and non-humans. And so I teach in prisons as well as at Wesleyan University, and I have sort of included in that edited collection discussions of both animal captivity and human captivity. My website also has a number of op-eds that I've written if you're interested in looking at the op-eds, and some of my papers can be accessible through the website as well if you just scroll down.
And also, if people go to the description on this video, it'll take you to the website as well, and to a web page that I have put together on your work on empathy. And there's also a video that you did about your work on Entangled Empathy, which is really good. You go just systematically through it, so I would really recommend anyone watch that as well.
Great.
So your book is like an alternative ethic for our relationships with animals, But for me, it was really meaningful because it's like way beyond there. It's really about a larger picture, vision of moving from an ethics of justice to an ethics of empathy and care. And as an activist and an empathy activist myself, I really come up against this ethics of justice, like in the social movements, and I'm out there advocating for empathy, and people are saying, hey, that's kind of weird, we got to be out there and demonstrating and kind of battling the forces of evil or what have you. So I really have, that's what I found really important and helpful, was just how you kind of systematically kind of lay out the ethics of justice and an ethics and compare it and contrast it to an ethics of empathy and care.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think is really interesting in a variety of ways is the way in which, if you're interested in thinking about the emotional, the rich, effective way in which we engage with the world, a lot of people think that it's either got to be empathy or something like anger. And for me, I think that, and a lot of activism is often sort of rooted, I think, in a kind of anger. I don't think that anger is necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that empathy, as I understand it, which is broader, is sort of a more impactful way of being in relationship with the rest of the world. For me, I think that justice is a part of empathy, actually. I don't see these things as in conflict with one another, but I think that to be empathetically engaged with social justice struggles is to be moving in this way back and forth between oneself and the other, and trying to understand better, whereas justice framework without empathy seems to just continue to separate us in all sorts of ways. And so that's partly why I think empathy is so important.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing there is that there's, in the justice, if it's just being angry at the person or the communities or whatever that you're in opposition to or angry about, that that's just one piece of it, but the other part is also to listen to them and to hear what's going on for the other side, and not just be, a lot of times the justice is, I mean, there's basic underlying values, like it's somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose.
Exactly.
And it's like, I'm going to win over, my movement is going to win over your movement, and there's not that empathy part where, well, okay, I'm willing to listen to you and what's going on for you. I'm going to share my anger and my feelings, and I want to be heard for it. And that there can be some kind of more of a transformation versus just this transaction.
That's perfectly stated. It's a transformative process as opposed to a process in which there's winners and losers. And I think one of the things that's important to me in thinking about empathy is that particularly in social justice work, is that we really want to be making progress. We don't want to simply be replacing one bad system with a system that has the features of the other system, only a different set of values. And I think real transformation has to occur when we sort of are always moving, not just stopping, but always moving.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that, I come from more of a progressive background, and my family are conservative evangelical Christians, and so I had a lot of these kind of conflicts, within the family. But I found that just by taking an empathic stance, really hearing what is going on for them, that we've been able to overcome difficulties, problems and conflicts. And actually, we're starting to do empathy circles now together, where we have a structured framework where everyone gets heard. We use empathic listening. So I really see that what you're laying out is really how to bring together, I see, the different political parties and how to get a connection going between the Democrats, Republicans, and all the different groups.
Well, I mean, I do think that there's an important sense in which we have to start to talk with each other. Talking past each other, screaming at each other, not hearing, not listening isn't really getting any of us anywhere. One of the things that's central to my thinking about empathy is how important it is. So the reason I'm talking about entangled empathy is because I take this idea that we're already in a whole bunch of relationships, and these relationships are in many ways fraught. And so if you start with the idea that we're in these relationships, I think most people would be pretty either horrified or embarrassed to acknowledge that their relationships are bad relationships, that they're in a bad relationship. And so when we start to take the frame that we're in relationships of all sorts with all sorts of beings, and those are bad relationships, that's a motivating factor for trying to make those relationships better. And how do we make these relationships better? Well, one way, obviously, is to try to figure out what's going on in the relationship that makes it not work. So it sounds like exactly what you were talking about in your family, only it could be writ large. You know, it's a much bigger project. And we're in relationships with all sorts of beings, not just human beings. I think we're in relationships with other animals, some of which are really terribly fraught. And so our actions are implicated in the continuation of those bad relationships. And so I think as a tool, entangled empathy can be very useful, not just for activists who are working to sort of change our relationships with other animals, but just change our relationships in general with all sorts of other people.
So when you're saying bad, what do you mean by bad? How would you describe what a bad relationship is?
I mean, I think that's a really important question. A bad relationship is a relationship in which one or both of or all of the parties in the relationship, and it doesn't need to be just two parties, aren't flourishing. And so what my view is that we ought to be promoting flourishing, and that's going to mean different things to different people, and that's going to mean different things for different animals. But ultimately, when the well-being of others is impacted negatively through our relationships, that's a time to be paying attention to trying to fix them. That's what I mean by a bad relationship. A relationship in which one or both or all parties are having their well-being negatively impacted. And of course, I think, well, I just want to make, so it's not, I don't think that suddenly all relationships are going to end up being sort of, oh, we just have to empathize and everything's going to get better. I mean, I think it's obvious that there's a lot of ways in which we can go wrong, and we have to fix it, and it's hard work, and you know, it's not a panacea, but I think it's a really, really central tool in making important changes in the way we live on the planet.
Well, in terms of entangled empathy, it's about relationships. So there's like a relationship with ourselves, with people near us, people afar, with animals, with nature. So it's really about almost like more of a way of being, too, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, it is a way of being, but it's a way of consciously being. It's a way of practicing, I would say. I think that empathy requires a lot of effort and work, and I think it's important, in my sense, that we recognize that it does take work, and there's tremendous payoffs, as you were saying. You know, sometimes relationships that are fraught become really meaningful and important and sustaining. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that it's not something you could just do. You have to really think about it, in my sense. You have to think about it. You have to reflect on it. You have to learn about the other, where they are. Listening is one aspect, but because I'm so concerned about other animals, listening requires a whole lot more than it does when we're talking one with each other. So it requires perceiving better. It requires recognition and understanding and gaining certain kinds of wisdom about how others live their lives, particularly when they're so different.
In your book, you lay out, you contrast an ethics of justice and ethics of empathy and care. And I think one of the first parts is you're saying an ethics of justice is more around individualism, kind of focusing on the individual, myself, or maybe yourself, the other, and that empathy is more about being aware of the relationship. I wonder if you could just go into that a little bit.
Yeah, so the traditional way of thinking about ethics, which is often called an ethics of justice, tends to see individuals as sort of distinct, abstract, rational beings that are if they connect with others, they can detach from those others as well. And my view is that that's actually what I would call sort of a false metaphysics or a false ontology. You can't actually be independent of all others at any point in time. And so the reason I think it's false is because I think it just misunderstands the ways in which relationships sustain us. Those people who are most able to feel like they've done it all themselves and they had no help doing it are precisely the people who are just not seeing the vast amounts of labor that goes into their success, if that's what we have in mind. And so I think that the kind of abstract individualism that's at the heart of a lot of traditional ethical theories or ethics of justice is just a faulty view of what we're doing with each other and what we do, how we live. We need each other, and we need all sorts of others in various ways. And so I think an ethics of empathy or an ethics of care, at least as I understand it, recognizes this entanglement. This is what I call entanglement. This entanglement that we're in with others, and that we can't avoid dependency, and that we need to value and recognize that dependency isn't a bad thing. Dependency is a way in which we're one of many ways, but an important central way in which we're connected with each other. A lot of times I think the ethics of justice has this view, in part, that what we want to try to do is overcome or transcend dependency, as if that's even possible. And my sense is that I don't think we need to do it. I think we need to simply recognize the ways in which we're both dependent on and supportive of each other and other beings.
Well, you've been an animal activist. I mean, you've been out there being an activist. I mean, kind of on this demonstrating, or how have you? That's what I saw. I said you're an activist.
Yes.
So
Well,
I'm
an activist. I haven't demonstrated in a long time, actually. Because, but I do. I'm an activist in the sense that I speak out and I write about these issues, and I work with students who are student activists. And so that's the sort of activism that I do, and I do this around prison issues and also around animal issues and women's issues and issues in general that have to do with a whole host of marginalized others. And so, but my activism at this point in my life is not, I'm not out, dying in always. Sometimes I do with the Black Lives Matter campaigns that have been going on. I've done a little bit more out in the world, but my activism at this point is more. I speak out more rather than sort of work in the streets.
Well, the reason I brought that up, especially because of Black Lives Matter, I've gone to some of the events here. There's been at UC Berkeley. There's been some, gatherings around. That's quite a few around that. And the kind of an ethics of justice is really big. You can really feel it in the space. And I'm out there talking about empathy, and it's almost like there's sometimes like even a hostility towards it, like empathy. There's no activist. That's not active, or there's all kinds of criticisms of it. And what I found in your book, it really lays out the kind of the arguments for an ethics of empathy. So I'm saying, oh, this is so great. I'm going to take this with me. This is it, folks. This is the explanation of what I've been trying to, tell you about, And so I was just wondering what your experience was within an activist environment, because you're out there, people are saying they're really into the, like you talk about rights versus, empathy and entanglement, and and about relationships. I'm just wondering, what is your experience in that environment, and especially getting the word out about empathy?
Yes, well, so I think you're quite right. There is a general feeling that in activist circles, what we need to be doing is focusing on our outrage and our anger at a system of injustice that constructs so many others as less important, disposable, unworthy, all of these sorts of things. And that's all true. That I don't disagree with. That's exactly the system that we're in. And I also actually understand that people are angry and they're upset and they're frustrated and feeling demoralized in many ways. And so the feelings of anger and the feelings of frustration are the problem is, of course, because I'm empathetic, I can say all this, right? So, it's a little bit sort of predictable. But what I do want to say is that I think that there's a role to play in taking a stance that is a stance of looking. I mean, I want to be able to acknowledge anger and allow for outrage in the face of such massive harms and injustice. I mean, it's the normal and important thing to do. And importantly, so many communities of color, women, are denied the opportunity to even express anger. It's not thought to be appropriate. So in that sense, I want to honor and respect the anger and frustration and outrage that so many people are feeling, and that I'm feeling as well. But I think that's an important point in the process. I think that, as we were talking about before, I think that that's a legitimate. These are all very legitimate, particularly in the context of such egregious state violence. It's very difficult when you have a system that's so powerful and that is systematically harming and killing so many, not to be outraged. So in that sense, I think the outrage is acceptable. But what I do is I try to put it into a bigger picture, like we were talking about before, a picture where we're imagining sort of how we can, in our more reflective moments, really start to think differently about the relationships that we're in. And, as I mentioned, I teach in a maximum security prison, and the men who are incarcerated there have engaged in violent activities, which is why they're there, but they've also lived in conditions in which violence seemed the only sort of normal response to violence. And so when I talk to them about empathy, they find it really engaging. And these are people who are incarcerated for a long period of time. So I think that the idea is that, anger has its place, but once we can sort of reflect back and think empathetically, it actually is more empowering often than anger. And that's something that I've found people really respond to. It's not a good idea, I don't think, to try to get angry people to not be angry and to start reflecting, because I think anger is one of those affective states that's just very powerful. But you can't stay angry for very long. And so once the anger dies down, it makes sense, I think, to start thinking empathetically.
Well, the approach I'm starting to take is that we need like a movement, an empathy movement of its own. It's a bit like a mediator. Like if you have a conflict, there's two parties, any kind of conflict, that it's helpful to have a third party who has that empathic presence and empathic experience and that resilience that can listen to both sides, as well as that once they've been heard, to start bringing them together to facilitate a dialogue between them. So if we look at the Black Lives Matter issue of, it's the African American community and the police or the social structures, that it seems that there's almost a need for this third empathic presence that can listen to both sides and also facilitate a dialogue. So that's something I'm trying to work on. So I'm just wondering how that kind of resonates. I mean, as a kind of a strategy.
I think it's important to think about sort of the dialogue, having a dialogue, but I also think it's really important that, you know, in the dialogue there are ways in which, you know, some individuals are behaving that is a failure of their own empathy to engage with others. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in the work I do and in the book Entangled Empathy is to try to help people recognize how for themselves in their own communities, in their own social justice work, and particularly in the case of animals, that they develop these empathetic skills. Because I think that a lot of the problems that we see, and this is what we were talking about a minute ago, the problems that we see are a result of really failures of moral, what I would call failures of moral perception, failures of empathetic engagement. And so I think that, you know, sharing those skills, so I see what you're saying about mediation as a sort of stopgap in conflicts, but I also think it's really important for people to start to learn and engage and practice empathy more.
So it's really, for example, an example would be within the Black Lives Matter or animal welfare groups or any of these different movements, that within those groups they start practicing, or even the police, that within those groups, within the groups themselves, that they start developing empathic you know, relationships within themselves. That would be like a stepping stone to...
Exactly. I mean, I'm asking, and I would focus really more on, you know, I think it's important for everybody, but I also think it's really important for those who are in positions of, you know, of power of various sorts, to start to think both about the positions of power that they're in and the privilege that they have as members of groups that are in power, and to, I mean, I think that there's more of an onus. So it's not, we live in such a stratified society, so I think part of what is happening in activist circles, it's not just that there are like two different viewpoints. There's a viewpoint that is empowered and has, you know, in some way legitimate state control over that power, and others that are disempowered. And so often it can be very frustrating for the disempowered or the voiceless to be asked or thought to try to be empathetic towards those in power, and I get that. And so I think it's really, I do think that doesn't mean that that shouldn't be done, because I actually think empathetic engagement is empowering, and I've seen it in, you know, in the men I work, the incarcerated students that I work with. But I also think that it's really important for those who are in positions of power to be able to start to engage. So in the conflict of Black Lives Matter, I mean, I think it's just super important to pay attention to the ways in which police violence is destroying, and consistently destroying and historically destroying, communities. And so in the face of that destruction, the pressure to be empathetic should be on the police. So yeah, I think that it's a hard question to bring the, you know, the theory and the practice together. I think it's super necessary to try to do that, and to try to find places and points at which you can bring this up. And so what you're doing, I think, is really important. And I can see, though, that there's going to be resistance as well. Particularly, you know, I think if you set up your sort of, you know, your empathy tent in front of the police station and try to get the police to start thinking empathetically, rather than sort of in the midst of the Black Lives Matter activists, you'd probably be met with a certain amount of anger and frustration there too, and it might be a little bit more frightening to be outside of a police station trying to encourage them to be empathetic. But have you done that?
I haven't. I've set up in downtown Berkeley. I don't know if you've been to Berkeley, but there's the main BART station, which is the gateway to the campus as well, and the police station is 2 blocks away. So I've been setting up there, and that's actually something I had wanted to ask you about, because you talked about rights as part of the justice kind of movement. It's active. And I've been dealing with these very issues around the empathy tent. Like, I'm setting up the empathy tent and I'm looking at what is my position, and I can go under free speech, like, you know, I've got the freedom of speech, and we're speaking, and the tent itself is an empathy, is an expression of my speech. And the city, I'm trying to say, okay, I'm willing to get a permit, and the city is saying, well, we won't give you a permit for the tent, but we'll give you a permit for, you know, a little umbrella or something. So, and I'm saying, okay, I'm hearing you don't want to give me a permit, but I'm willing to empathize with you in a dialogue about it, an empathic, and I've invited the city into an empathy circle. And they said, we don't have time for it.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering, and I was dealing with this very issue that you're talking about, rights. I don't want to say I have this right. I'm trying to say that empathy precedes laws somehow. I was looking for the vocabulary for it, and I was really wondering what your thoughts were, because I wanted to say that, and I didn't want to say I have a right for empathy. It's more like I have a need, or we have a pre-existing human need or something. So I'm looking for how to frame it, you know. So
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that it is. I understand what you're saying. It's such a hard thing to do in the context of a system in which everything is organized around rights.
Yeah.
So the system is set up in such a way that, you know, rights are the lingua franca. This is how we make our claims, and it also is important to recognize that there's a certain power in using the tools that are given to us. But of course, you know, as Audre Lorde said, the master's tools aren't going to dismantle the master's house. And so I think that we're in a situation in which we really have to think creatively about this. And I think it's not terrible to, you know, use the language of strategically, to use that kind of language to try to create something different. And it is through our free speech that we're able to communicate about ideas that are going to help develop a culture of empathy. So it's an issue too that often happens when you're thinking about sort of cultures that live within the United States that don't have the same. I'm thinking of indigenous peoples, and some indigenous peoples who don't sort of recognize the same individual rights kind of views, and so there's always this problem where to get recognition for the kind of work and the kind of existence that they want, rights can't give you that recognition. And this is one of the big conflicts about how to live in a multicultural kind of world. And so I see what you're saying. You don't want, you know, you don't want to claim your rights to have this open, to have your tent there, but at the same time, you know, you might just have to sometimes think, okay, instrumentally, I need to just make a claim about my rights. Even, you know, you could think of it as rights, or, you know, rights or something like that.
Yeah, I've got a foot in both camps. So I am doing the rights approach, or the free speech approach, or I'm also looking for a vocabulary around. It's almost like a need, that we have a need. I sent an email to the city. I was in dialogue with them, and I said, I'm here to listen to you. I'm listening to the staff. I'm willing to offer empathy to the police. And I was saying that there's an inalienable need for empathy, in the sense that we're biologically wired to need empathy, and that precedes any laws or any rules, or and then also that rules and laws, are they designed to foster that and support that need for empathy, or are they designed to support, like, obedience to authority? Or, you know, what are the rules for?
Right. I mean, I think the rules are for various things, but I'm with you 100%. But this is the problem. This is exactly where this theoretical problem hits the practice road, as it were, because, as I said, we have to back up and think about the very structure of the social space that we're in, and there's so many flaws with that the construction of that social space, but we're not in a position to reconstruct it at that level. And so I think basically to try to figure out gaps and places, like you said you're doing, to try to say this is what can be better. And it might also be that, I mean, I wonder if I wonder if there's really so much of a problem with the idea that you're like, why can't you just have your tent? I don't understand, like, what will happen if you just set up your tent? Will they ask you to take it down? And then if they do, will that offer you an opportunity for dialogue and empathetic exchange with them? And maybe that's a good way to do it, to have something that's a little jarring, that doesn't quite have the state authority, but that provides you with an opportunity to engage with people that you might not otherwise have. So thinking about it a little bit more of like a jujitsu kind of thing. So here you are setting up your tent. You don't really have permits to set up your tent, but in the process of setting up your tent, you'll encounter people, maybe police, that you'll be able to empathize with. So in some ways it seems like a nice piece of activism to get empathy into different spaces.
That's exactly what's been happening. I've set up about 8 days now and without permit. So what I'm saying is I'm going to set up without a permit, and if you can show me compelling reasons not to have this empathy tent there, I'm willing to empathize with you. And then my position is if the police come, if the city sends the police, and the police have walked by and I say hello and all that, so it's very cordial. And so my position is if the police do come and say you can't have this, that I would, and then they could write a citation, that I wouldn't accept the citation, and that could mean like a 72-hour jail hold supposedly, which I'm willing to do for force or engage in this conversation. So I'm saying I'm willing to dialogue. I'm doing this, and show me why I shouldn't do it, and I'm willing to empathize with you, but I also want to be heard as well, so I want to be empathized with as well, and I want an empathic relationship, and I'm open for that. So that's kind of the strategy, and so far they haven't bothered me. And the other part about setting up at the police station, I would love to do that, set up right in front there, and I've given some of the police my card, which is a free empathy. It's like, 10 minutes of free empathy, and that's it's really to create that, and what I'm really finding is that by doing the activism, it's uncovering the places where the city is not being empathic or willing not to dialogue. So it's really, you have to do it to uncover, because they're saying we don't have time to talk to you. So that's a moment where it's being revealed that the city is not willing to be empathic. So the activism is good just to reveal that. I think that was what the civil rights was about, was revealing those unempathic spaces.
That's right. I think that's right. That's great.
So yeah. So do you have any more about the rights part? Because that, going for rights and what the other side is, how that vocabulary, like if we're not going for rights, what are we going for? Like, what are we saying that we're going for? We're going for empathy, or we're going for a need for empathy, or a universal need, or...
So my view is a view that, so the problem with rights, I think the problem with rights is that they're fundamentally individualistic, and they actually are designed as barriers. So the reason that we have rights, that the reason you have a right to free speech is because you have a right against the state and against others to say certain kinds of things. So already a right is about disconnect and severing relationships, whereas empathy is a way of honoring and recognizing the sort of relationships that exist. And so in some ways it's very difficult to figure out in a rights-based scheme how you're supposed to, in an individualistic scheme, how you're supposed to replace rights with what. Because it's not about replacing rights. It's about figuring out how to rethink the kinds of connections that we're in with one another. And having said that, of course, in a very practical way, because so many people are having their rights violated in such egregious ways, it's not it should not be on people who are suffering from massive rights violations to have to start thinking about, oh, I want to be in relationship differently. I feel completely fine about, the struggle to assert some sort of respect and need for recognition given historical and contemporary vast inequality and injustice. But having said that, I think it's also really important to be thinking about how empathy might build. So I guess, this is a bit of a, you might think, a bit of a cop-out, and I don't mean it to be, but until we're really in a system in which we're able to empathize with each other, that we recognize the vast relationships that we're in with one another, and that we can actually start talking to each other, not about the way in which you're violating my rights, but the way in which you're failing to empathize, we're not going to really know what we replace rights with until we get to that place where it makes sense to say, well, no, you're not hearing me, or in doing that, you're really failing to empathize with this other. And part of, as you know from the book, at the end I talk about ways in which we go wrong in our empathy and we can correct empathy. This is already imagining that people want to sort of get into the process of thinking about what empathy should be like and how we should engage empathetically with one another. So I hear what you're saying. It's really difficult to think about what are we replacing rights with, but it's really a bigger shift than that. It's about thinking instead about our relationships, the ways in which our perspective and the perspective of those we're empathizing with, going back and forth between those, deepening and developing those relationships, changing those relationships as we empathize, and then we might get to a place where there's more of a sort of way of speaking about empathetic failures that's a lot different than rights violations. And I think that, just to go back to your idea of need, I think it's more basic than need. Maybe need is very basic, but it's really, we are in these relationships, and we pretend we're not, but we are in them, and so we need to just get them. We need to recognize that we're in these relationships and start to uncover what is the nature of this relationship, what is the nature of this relationship, and how do we make these relationships good for all the parties involved. Certainly in the Black Lives Matter context, this is the onus on the police forces all across the country. And so it seems that, if somebody like you was really able to work with the police, that would be an amazing thing, because they really do need to, they're the ones in positions of power who really do need to figure out how to change those relationships, because otherwise the conflict is just going to continue and deepen. And they need some help. So maybe you can help them.
I'm glad to do that. Well, when you were talking about relationships and seeing that we are in relationship, what came up for me was I'd interviewed Marco Iacoboni, who he wrote the book Mirroring People. So he wrote about mirror neurons.
Right.
And I asked him, how do we build a culture of empathy, which is how do we raise the level of empathy and make people make that a social value? And he felt just if people realized how mirror neurons worked, that's kind of the scientific or biological mechanism that just shows that we are in relationship whether we like it or not. That we're constantly mirroring people within our being, and so that was just one piece of creating that understanding, it seems.
Right. There's the biological piece. There's also, importantly, what I focus on is the social and ethical piece. That there's these relationships that sort of extend in various ways, and ultimately, in some sense, I think it's about our own moral character, our own moral agency. I want to be in. So I believe that we're in these relationships inevitably. There's no way to escape these various relationships that we're in, and I want to be attentive to those relationships. It's part of what it means to be an ethical agent in the world, is to recognize the relationships that I'm in and to be sure that I'm sort of making those relationships as good as possible. That is, that I'm working to enhance the well-being of all of those that I impact, or at least at best, I mean, that's at best, at least not impact negatively or harmfully or cause any sort of failures of flourishing or well-being. And this is a hard thing to do because it requires a vast amount of knowledge, because the relationships that we're in these days are so entangled and sort of far-reaching. So we're in relationships with people who are, picking fruit for us in, or parts of the world, making things in other parts of the world. We're in relationships with people who are working in, coal or gas pipelines, bringing, all these relationships are operating, and some of them, we're going to have less ability to do the right things by, because they're so downstream in a way. But being aware of those relationships, I think, helps us to think deeper, and to also build better connections and live better, and to try to as again, this is what I'm saying. I don't think we can necessarily impact the well-being of others very far downstream in some causal network, but I think that we can learn from reflecting empathetically on those relationships that will help in more immediate ways. So, yeah.
Well, you brought up about well-being, so that's something you brought up in the book as well. It's really about how to foster well-being and flourishing, and that more empathic way of being would foster that well-being.
I think that's right, yeah.
So that's kind of like a cornerstone of...
That's ultimately, I think, why we would want. I mean, in some ways, I think, as you've pointed out, there's sort of this biological way in which we do mirror others. But one of the criticisms that I often hear of empathy is that, well, good torturers are very empathetic. And so, for me, a good torturer isn't empathetic, because empathy is actually, for me, the way I conceive of it, and the way I'd like to promote it, is that it's actually designed to enhance well-being and enhance the possibilities of flourishing, not to diminish them. So it's not simply sort of feeling what someone else feels and then manipulating or torturing or doing anything like that. That's not the kind of empathy that I'm interested in. The kind of empathy that I'm interested in is this one that is centrally about creating conditions in which the well-being of everyone is promoted. And so in that way, if you think about it, so rights, your right to free speech, and other people's rights to equal recognition can be sort of instrumental stepping stones to the ultimate promotion of well-being. But empathy needs to be a part of it. I think that entangled empathy is sort of an umbrella that can take on justice in its particular, in instrumental ways. I think justice is sort of one smaller part of this overarching empathy. It's not that justice is here and empathy is here. That doesn't give empathy enough weight. Empathy is over that, and justice can be used in certain instances, given the conditions. I mean, one of the examples that I think is so important in thinking about empathy, and I often use, is the ways in which, when you see someone when you as somebody who's empathetic see someone who is being victimized by injustice, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing an injustice happening, and you're reacting and engaging with that injustice, and you're empathetically going to try to figure out what the person who's the victim of this injustice would want to see happen, and you're going to try to intervene to try to undo that injustice. So injustice is a part of what we see when we're empathetically engaging. It's what we attend to, just as harms are what we attend to, and disappointments and frustrations are what we attend to. But also happiness and flourishing is what we attend to.
Well, there was a lot in that, but with the torture and all that, I hear that come up a lot, even with like folks like Frans de Waal. He uses that, even though he writes a lot about empathy.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's a lot. I could kind of go on and on. I'm a little concerned about the time here because we're almost at an hour. But so yeah, where did I think the one thing about that torture, just for that part, is for me that's not an empathic relationship.
Right,
It's a
right.
sense that both parties aren't feeling heard. For me, it's like both parties need to be heard. Like the torture might be having, and I hear this from others, Paul Bloom, etc. That
Exactly.
you've got this empathy, and then the empathy is leading to this torture. But for me, what that torture part is more of a power over, which is not empathic. So it's like having a heartbeat breath, or it's like saying breathing leads to torture or something, right? It's the same kind of thing. What is the causal effect? You can't say that the empathy is leading to the torture. It's just as breathing is leading to the torture. It's that somebody's empathic. Maybe they're reading somebody's emotion, but you can also kind of divide your mind in the sense that you can have empathy in one part, be using it, and then be unempathic. George Lakoff has talked about that. I don't know if you
That's
looked at
right.
his work. That
That's
we
right.
can. So it's not just the part that's doing the torture is not listening and hearing and empathizing with the needs and you can
No.
actually ask. You can ask the torturee, "Are you feeling heard?" And the torturer said, "No, you're not
Yeah.
listening to me." Right? It's not. So it's really not a. So there's a lot really to unpack that whole argument, which I see over and over again, which I
Over and
think is
over.
really inaccurate. So,
I think it's
but
inaccurate. I think one of the things that's really, I mean, I want to get this in before we run out of time here, but one of the things that I think is really important in thinking about empathy is that a lot of people, and I say this at the beginning of the book, a lot of people think they know what empathy is, and it has a lot of different meanings. And so we just need to be clear still as people are starting to get more interested in and take up and maybe even argue against empathy, which I'm actually been giving a bunch of talks lately called Empathy, a Defense, which is kind of amazing to think we need to defend empathy, but we do. But I think it's really important to clarify some of the misconceptions that are associated with empathy. And I think you're right. The people who argue that it's the torture, that a torturer can be a good empathizer, they're thinking of empathy in a very specific kind of way, which really just involves emotion reading. That's it. It's emotion reading. So if you can read someone's emotions well, you can figure out how to manipulate those emotions. There's nothing else about it. But the way that you talk about empathy, the way I talk about empathy, and the way that I think empathy is going to ultimately make a difference is when we think of it as fundamentally tied to these other features of our relationships. And you've been talking a lot about hearing and listening, and I think that's exactly right. I think it's a central part of what we need to do, attend to, and understand, and really work on getting clear about the perspective of the other. That's what these other empathy people think too. But further, I think there needs to be an understanding of the promotion of well-being as the reason that this is happening in the first place. That we're trying to encourage people not just to accept that they're in relationships, but to recognize that those relationships could be better or worse, and they're implicated in the bad ones. And I think that part of what needs to happen is that in so many ways, I mean, I guess there's going to always be outliers, but I want to believe that most people, if they thought they were causing those they were closest to harm, they wouldn't choose to do that. If they were reflecting, they wouldn't choose to cause those they're closest to harm, because it harms themselves when they do that. Empathy reveals that, and I think that ultimately, if we can get people to recognize that in their most immediate relations, it starts to be possible to branch out from there.
well, I want to say this book I think was one of the most important books I've looked at or read really in the last quite a while, and because it's like you've got this sense of clarity and can articulate it so well. I just find this an amazing book, and also just talking to you and hearing your clarity of vision and understanding and articulation. I'm just so glad you are working on this, and I hope are you going to be continuing working around the theme of
Oh
empathy, or
yeah,
because
yeah.
this is great?
Oh, I'm so glad I'm so delighted to hear that. Thank you so much, and thank you for your work. Appreciate that.
Okay, then I'll stop the recording there. Thank you so much.